Hello, welcome, friend. Tonight, let's settle in together and listen to a story whispered by the oldest winds across the desert, the tale of Jael, a woman who tipped the scales of history in the quiet folds of her tent. This story springs from a time when fear pressed close to every village and hope, well, it mostly played hide-and-seek. But as you follow with me, you'll see how courage sometimes comes bundled with a soft laugh and a sturdy heart, even when the world seems upside down. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a gentle word for others joining us tonight, a message of hope, a memory, or even a small joke. And if these softly spoken journeys make sense to you, consider subscribing so we can share many more. Lean back, the lanterns are glowing, and the night is waiting for us. The night air in Israel was heavy, the sort that made even the olive trees murmur secrets to each other as the wind passed by. Across the scattered tents and low, stony hills, a quiet dread had settled on the land. People moved softly, keeping close to the flaps of their homes, glancing up at every distant rumble with wary eyes. For years, the people of Israel had worn the yoke of Jabin, king of Canaan. He ruled from his distant, fortified city. A place, rumor said, was stacked to the sky with iron, pride, and not a pinch of mercy. His general, the infamous Sisera, marched 900 iron chariots over the earth, and each time their wheels thundered through the countryside, hearts squeezed a little tighter in frightened chests. Children played their games closer to the fires. Mothers watched the horizon more than the pot, and men muttered sharp prayers as they patched leaking roofs. To live under Jabin's rule meant growing used to the taste of fear baked into the flatbread at breakfast, folded into the corners of all whispered conversations. Many a story was told beside the evening flames, rumors of another neighbor carried off, a field of barley trampled to a memory, a festival cut short by the dark shadow of approaching soldiers. Maybe tomorrow will be easier, one woman would say, her hands kneading dough that would disappear far too quickly. A neighbor would answer, or maybe tomorrow we'll learn to run faster, A.D. There was a strange resilience hidden in the people, a kind of humor that survived on scraps of defiance. They coped with heavy hearts and light words, the way only those who've seen too many hard seasons can. Through the patchwork of tents and dirt roads, fear walked boldly as a guest who had long overstayed their welcome. And still, at night, when the fires burned low, some dared to look at the stars and hope. Maybe someone would find the courage none of them dared to name aloud. But that was a whisper for another day, and on this night, as the darkness thickened and the land fell ever more quiet, the weight of Jabin's rule pressed close, making the silence ring with 1,000 unspoken prayers. In a world where iron ruled and men marched with heavy boots, it was almost laughable to think of a woman leading armies, let alone a prophet sitting beneath the shade of a palm tree. But then, there was Deborah. She was not cut from the usual cloth. If you asked around, some would say Deborah's laughter was sharper than her advice, and both were in steady supply. She was known as a prophetessa, rare sight in those times, and people traveled from distant villages just to hear her speak judgment or whisper a word of encouragement. Her palm tree, they said, was the one bit of shade where truth sat comfortably and rumors dared not go. By day, she welcomed those who came with quarrels and grievances. Farmers, with dirt under their nails, shuffled forward to argue over goats and fields. Wives, their hair tied back tight, came seeking wisdom about children, about worries, about surviving one more day under the thumb of Jabin. Deborah listened with a patience that made hurried men fidget, then answered with clarity and conviction. "You worry too much," she'd tell an old man whose bag of grain never felt full enough. "Have you tried adding a handful of hope to your harvest?" Somehow, with Deborah, complaints left lighter than they arrived. It wasn't just her insight. It was the way she looked at the world, as if every problem had a solution tucked inside it, like a seed hiding in hard earth. But her words carried weight, and the people began to wonder. Perhaps hope had not left Israel altogether, just taken up residence under a palm tree for a while. Some nights you could hear children giggling, daring each other to run and touch the hem of her garment when she wasn't looking. The braver ones would boast, "I saw Deborah smile at me. Tomorrow's going to be safe." It wasn't iron or armies that made Deborah stand out in those dangerous days. It was something quieter, subtler, light in her that refused to hide. Everyone knew, when the land groaned and the nights stretched long, Deborah's voice would still be there, steady as ever. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to spark something bold in the hearts of those who listened. If Deborah was the steadfast palm in the heat, Barak was more like a sheepdog caught between the herd and a wolf, fur bristling but not quite sure which way to run. He was Israel's chosen commander, though not always by his own choosing. His courage arrived in fits and starts, and only after much convincing. Barak's brow wore the lines of a man who'd counted too many losses. You'd find him sharpening a sword while scanning the horizon, muttering to himself as if the distant clouds might turn into chariots at any moment. People in the camp respected him, mostly because he was the one who stood closest to the edge, close enough to danger, but not quite stepping into it without a good nudge. Leading a tired people is no easy task. These weren't warriors gathered around Barak, but farmers, carpenters, even the odd shepherd who still flinched at the sound of thunder, remembering iron wheels, not rainy skies. Their armor was patched together from kitchen pots and leftover courage. Whenever Barak called for volunteers, most looked at their sandals and suddenly remembered pressing business at home like urgent goat-sitting. Still, there was something likable about him, a sort of unvarnished honesty. He didn't pretend to be fearless, didn't bark orders he couldn't stomach himself. If he joked, it was the kind born from nerves. "We may not have iron chariots," he'd say, scanning his mismatched flock, "but at least our sandals won't rust." Sometimes, in the deep hours of the night, when the air was thick with worry, Barak would look across the camp's dim fires at his people, tired, smudged with dust, but still sharing scraps of dried fig and hope. He wondered where strength would come from this time, if a tired heart could beat out a victory when iron bore down from all sides. He was a man not without doubts, and perhaps that made his quiet persistence matter all the more. In Barak, they saw their own trembling courage, reflected a leader not above them, but with them, feeling every chill the wind carried. And as the days wore on, they wondered, as did he, what would it take to finally push back the darkness hanging over their land? If you ever met Sisera, you'd know at once he was the sort of man who didn't just enter a room, he thundered into it. He didn't need to say much. 900 iron chariots spoke for him, each one gleaming under the sun like it had swallowed 100 men's sweat and pride. And if you happened to be standing near the road when that army rolled past, you wouldn't soon forget it. The ground shook, and your knees might feel like bargaining with gravity for a while. Sisera wasn't king, but nobody in Canaan mistook who really held the whip. His reputation stampeded ahead of him, scattering any hope of rebellion like sparrows before a storm. He was famous for his sharp mind and, it was rumored, even sharper elbows at the dinner table. Some said he could read fear in a face before a word was spoken, and he collected enemy secrets the way other men collected debts, without mercy and with a rather creative sense of interest. Civilians used to whisper about his chariots, as if they were monsters out of an old story. "Did you hear?" they'd say, peering into the dust behind their curtains. "I heard Sisera's wheels can grind a stone to powder." "Nonsense," someone else would answer. "It's the iron you should worry about." Not just his rides, but the heart beating behind the armor. Whenever Sisera rode, the villagers tensed up. Mothers pulled children indoors. The market sellers stashed their best bread under tables, praying that bread would outlast the thunder. No one invited Sisera inside for tea. Let's put it that way. There was a certain irony to his fame. For all the noise of his armies, it was the silence he left behind that unsettled the most. Fields flattened, stories whispered, resolve trampled down like broken wheat. Sisera's legacy spread like a shadow, dark and deep. Yet even among his own soldiers, there were more than a few who wondered if iron alone could hold a land forever. Some joked under their breath, "If this is security, I'd trade my armor for a quiet night and a full meal." Israel trembled under Sisera's heel. He liked it that way. But fate, as it often does, was already busy carving cracks into iron, silent, patient, and thankfully for the Wiraquite, unaware of Sisera's opinion. Night settled softly on the camp. Curling around the small fires like a cat, looking for warmth, the men and women of Israel, wrapped in worn blankets and heavier thoughts, made what peace they could with the darkness. No one spoke too loudly, not with Sisera's chariots out there somewhere, waiting beyond the safe circle of the lanterns. Even so, people found ways to coax a small laugh from their world. Dry bread, for example, was less a meal and more an exercise in patience. Someone would squint at the flaky crust and mutter, "If the Lord wanted us to enjoy it, he would have sent teeth like Sisera's wheels that earned a soft snort from the next blanket over." A boy, chewing without enthusiasm, grumbled, "At least it doesn't run us over." To that, a tired elder replied, "Count your blessings. At my age, I fear both bread and chariots." Around each little fire, old routines danced with new anxieties. There was the nightly ritual of checking on sleeping children, staring into the dark as if answers might be growing out there with the wild olives. Cards were played with stones, for betting no one in the camp had real money, and if they did, they'd have hidden it under a sleeping mat long ago. Yet, laughter did travel, even thin and cautious, between mouthfuls of last year's figs. Rumors too abound, miraculous escapes, or how Deborah's palm trees seemed to grow taller every season, just to keep an eye on the invaders. Some of the women joked that if you stood under it long enough, you could borrow a little courage by osmosis. One, poking at the fire, said, "If you see Deborah in your dreams, ask her for a recipe for softer bread." It was never raucous laughter, nothing loud enough to wake the moon, but it beat back the dark all the same. There was something stubborn in these people. They'd been pressed flat, yes, but the things that bubbled up in the night room a hope. Even scraps of humor showed that fear hadn't managed to choke the heart out of everyone just yet. So the camp held together, patchwork and provisional, breathing in the night air and exhaling the dream faint, but still alive. That deliverance, when it came, might look an awful lot like an ordinary conversation, somewhere between the hardness of the bread and the softness of the laughter. One cool morning, when the dew was still busy outshining the dust, Deborah's steady voice called for Barak. She did not summon with trumpet or fanfare, just a firm, unmistakable tone that traveled across the camp like it knew exactly who ought to hear it. Barak came, sword hanging by his side, and 100 worries clinging closer than his tunic. Deborah didn't waste time with pleasantries. She looked at him, eyes sharp as new olive leaves, and spoke as though the answer was already written in the clouds. "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go, take with you 10,000 men and lead them to Mount Tabor. Sisera, with all his chariots and troops, will be delivered into your hands there." Barak shifted, perhaps wishing she'd started with an easier errand like moving a mountain with a cooking spoon. He scratched his beard and eyed the horizon, which, for all its openness, felt suddenly too small to hide him from such a task. "Deborah," he said, trying out her name like one tests a door before braving the storm outside. "If you go with me, I'll go. If not, well, you'll have to find someone braver." It was meant as a compliment, or maybe a joke, but the tremor behind his words was all too real. The camp whispered stories of warriors struck down by a single glance from Sisera's iron chariots. Barak was no fool. He knew courage sometimes needed a little nudge, or, failing that, a very determined prophet. Deborah didn't argue. She smiled slightly, the way only someone used to reluctant champions could. Around them, the camp continued as usual, the thin laughter at breakfast quieting as the weight of her words spun out towards 10,000 uncertain hearts. A decision hung in the air with the promise of morning. Barak's journey would begin, but not on his strength alone. If he was going down this road, he wanted Deborah riding shotgun. You couldn't really blame him that Palm Tree had seen a lot, but iron wheels were a different kind of trouble altogether. Deborah looked at Barak, a mixture of kindness and something sharper flickering in her gaze, like sunlight glancing off a blade. There was no surprise in her face. She'd heard this kind of hesitance before, and maybe she even expected it. Her answer landed gentle but unmistakable, like a pebble breaking the hush over a pond. "I will surely go with you," she replied, voice steady as ever. "But understand this, Barak. The path you're afraid to walk alone will end in triumph, but not the way you might expect. The honor of victory will not be yours. The Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." That line, carried by the morning breeze, caught the ears of more than a few who pretended not to listen. Some snickered from behind tent flaps the fierce commander, strong enough to hold a sword, but needing someone else to hold his courage. Even the chickens, scratching their way around camp, seemed to cluck with special enthusiasm that morning, as if they sensed something unusual brewing. Barak tried to hide his embarrassment, shrugging as if the outcome mattered little so long as the job got done. "As long as we get there," he murmured, "let the songs tell it however they like." In truth, he was grateful, relieved, even that Deborah would stand beside him. Palm Tree, wisdom and all, through whatever trouble rolled their way. So it was settled. Deborah rose, brushing the dust from her robe, and the air brightened just a little. Around them, hope stirred where despair had camped far too long. Maybe tonight, the story would begin on the lips of the boldest how a woman, with the help of another, would outwit iron and change the shape of morning's song. And if Barak winced at the irony, well, sometimes the best victories walk into camp wearing sandals you didn't expect. The word spread through the camp like the aroma of fresh bread, swift, irresistible, impossible to ignore. Deborah and Barak, side by side, were gathering an army, not a legion of seasoned warriors, but a patchwork crowd of the tired, the hopeful, and the well. "I suppose someone has to go." You could hear the nervous chatter before you ever saw the gathering. Some compared their sticks to real spears. Others peeked inside pots for a last lucky fig, as if snacks might be the secret weapon. At Mount Tabor's foot, the whisper of fear mingled with a low hum of wonder. Some men fiddled with slings and debated tactics. Others shared family stories just loud enough to chase away the shiver of what might come. Old friends ribbed each other with jokes that barely disguised their shaking hands. "If I don't return, tell my donkey I finally found a better cause," one said, setting off horse laughter. The air throbbed with equal parts worry and stubborn hoper, tension as real as the stones underfoot. Even among the women who stayed behind, there ran a thread of pride, their whispered prayers, sown with both faith and sly humor. "Keep an eye on Barak," one told Deborah as she passed. "He's likely to trip over his own courage if you aren't careful." Barak walked through the throng, trying to look firm, but only half succeeding. The faces looking back at him were sunburned, bearded, and determined in a patched-together sort of way. Most had more calluses than confidence, but no one was turning away. As the sun slid lower, their hopes and doubts tangled together in the long shadows, united, not by strength, but by the wild idea that perhaps this time, with Deborah's steady hand guiding them, things might just turn out different. So the people of Israel gathered, their stories weaving together in the cool twilight, every fear and every snatch of laughter floating up to meet the stars. And somewhere among them, beneath the sound of sandals and whispered hopes, the first faint chord of courage was quietly tuning itself for what lay ahead. While armies gathered and iron wheels rattled across the distant hills, there lived a woman named Jael. She was not one to stand at the front of any crowd, nor did she seek the thick of any battle. Instead, Jael watched the world from the quiet doorway of her tent, as steady and silent as the hills that cradled her home. She moved softly through her days, eyes quick to notice a loose pebble on the path or a change in the wind. If she laughed, it was always on the inside a secret joke traded with her goats, or at the expense of a neighbor's clumsy attempt to balance 2 jars and an opinion all at once. Jael's tent sat along the crossroads, a patch of earth where travelers and rumors both took a moment to rest. She listened more than she spoke, collecting scraps of stories and news like wildflowers pressed into a book. Some said you could trust her with your secrets. Others swore she knew what happened long before anyone else dared to whisper it. Those close to her sometimes wondered what she thought of all this noise, the shouts of command, the anxious prayers, the distant and regular thunder of Sisera's chariots. But Jael kept her thoughts close, her hands busy, and her intentions wrapped up tight in calm patience. She knew that sometimes the world's biggest waves broke quietly against the smallest rocks. Standing at her tent, she seemed an ordinary presence, unremarkable, perhaps, to those moving too quickly to see. But anyone who paused and met her clear-eyed gaze might have caught a glimmer of something else, the kind of quiet bravery that waits and listens and only acts when the time is right. In the lull between footsteps and the whistling wind, Jael watched the shadows stretch long across her patchwork rugs, and wondered, as women always have, just what part the quiet ones play in a world lined with noise and steel. Jael wasn't just any woman living by the crossroads. She was the wife of Heber, a Kenite, whose tent was pitched not too far from the worn trails and secret gossip of Israel. The Kenites had a reputation: practical, shrewd, friendly with nearly everyone, and rarely the type to pick a side before the dust had settled. Heber, more diplomat than warrior, had made alliances as skillfully as Jael needed her bread, enough to stay on good terms with both neighbors and passing strangers. Their tent was the sort of place where news arrived before supper but left by dawn, bundled in the packs of travelers or muttered over the rim of a clay cup. Heber often played host to traders, messengers, and once even a runaway goat, though. The memory of chasing that guest from under the bed still made Jael's lips twitch in amusement. Peace with everyone was the family motto, and biscuits for all who passed by could almost have been their flag. Jael played her part quietly, weaving between her husband's guests with a pitcher in hand and her ears wide open. She knew how to offer honey with one hand and secrets withhold with the other. Balance learned from watching both the hills and her own kin. If people spoke of her, it was with a shrug and a nod. Jael, she sees everything, says nothing, but her eyes could weigh your stories before you've even swallowed your pride. Living at such a crossroads meant that Jael's days were full of odd visitors, shifting alliances, and the constant need to keep the peace in a land tied up by tension. Her tent was humble but strong, stitched tight against both dust storms and rumors blowing in from far-off battles. It was no palace, nor even the grand house of a judge, but it was a center of its own, a resting place where the world's noise met the calm hush of someone always watching, always waiting. And, tucked inside that ordinary routine, Jael carried the rarest gift of all, the art of being prepared for whatever came walking or running through her door. Jael's tent was a peculiar kind of oasis. It sat quietly at the edge, where wild grass met the beaten path, its canvas flaps bleached from years beneath the sun, and the laughter of countless guests catching on every rope. Inside, the air always carried a hush, part spice, part something more faithful, like a promise you knew would be kept. The floor was a patchwork of woven rugs, each one telling a bit of family history. A faded blue from her mother's old cloak, warm reds from a trade long ago, and one stubbornly itchy corner that Jael never managed to soften, no matter how many times she beat the dust from it. The corners of the tent held shadows of busy days, baskets full of grain, a jar for milk, the odd sandal that seemed determined to hide just when you needed it most. In the early hours, the tent became a watchpost. Jael could see travelers on the horizon long before they arrived, us curling up behind a hurried step, or the slower bobbing of a merchant and his excuses. She listened to the murmurs riding the wind, snippets of news or barely a strained laughter, and tucked each one away as skillfully as she tucked her hair beneath her scarf. Rumors were like smoke around her door. Some swore that the Kenites were clever cowards, always making friends but never taking sides. Others whispered that Jael's quiet was not cowardice at all, but calculation after all. It takes a certain courage to remain at peace when swords are clattering everywhere else. Still, within these canvas walls, there was a peace that even Sisera's shadow couldn't breach. Guests entered and left lighter than they arrived, and real laughter, flavored with relief, lingered in the air long after the stories had ended. If Jael prayed, it was in private, in the gentle hush between chores. And if she worried, only the goats seemed to notice. She kept her eyes on the horizon, her hands busy with the chores of survival, and her heart tuned to that delicate balance between welcome and watchfulness. And as the world beyond her tent spun ever closer to chaos, Jael's quiet vigilance became her shielder, calm in the eye of a gathering storm. On this particular day, the peace around Jael's tent was stretched thin, nearly see-through. From her doorway, she watched the sky grow restless, and the hills in the distance begin to tremble, not with thunder, but with the rising murmur of war. The air itself seemed to carry a warning, and even the goats refused to wander far, bleating as if they too heard something coming. A ribbon of dust wound its way along the horizon, too much for a lone traveler, too scattered for merchants. It was the sign of an army, and not the kind anyone wanted dropping by for supper. Closer to the battle lines, Israel's fighters braced themselves, eyes narrowed against the glare of sunlight on metal. Further off, mothers hunched over their dough, kneading a little faster, while children played within closer reach, laughter sounding oddly tight. As noon leaned heavy and bright, an unnatural noise grew louder, a deep, metallic rumble that settled in your ribs and made you test the strength of your own silence. It was the iron chariots, Sisera's pride. 900 wheels rolled as one, churning up the fields and flattening along the riverbanks, their drivers shouting back and forth, voices tinged with a cockiness that only comes from sitting well above the ground. Villagers squinted into the glare, fearful that the next turn might bring the storm down upon their own roofs. Some muttered that you could smell iron in the air, sharp and cold, like the world itself was holding its breath. Jael listened to it, all the slap of leather reins, the rhythmic snort of horses, the noise of metal stronger than any morning prayer. Life might try to carry on, bread to be baked, floors to be swept, animals to corral, but every task felt half-finished. Every sound outside the tent, a possible omen. The rumble and dust of battle drew nearer, leaving behind nerves stretched taut and a land waiting for whatever wild thing would happen next. Yet, in her tent, Jael made sure each thing was in its place, the kind of order that readied not just a home but a heart. Outside, war approached with a roar. Inside, the hush before a storm gathered its own quiet strength, steadying the hands of a woman watching history's footsteps pounding ever closer. Not far from Jael's tent, chaos was shredding the order of the day. Sisera, the mighty commander, found himself in unfamiliar territory, the wrong side of victory. The iron chariots he once considered invincible, now bogged down in mud, scattered like startled geese, while his soldiers, so quick to boast, melted away faster than rain on hot sand. The battle had turned, silent prayers had found their moment, and fate always fond of a little show had delivered a surprise. Sisera's breath came ragged, feet pounding the loose earth, with the desperation of a man who knew that, for once, his reputation was a very poor shield. His armor, polished and awe-inspiring just this morning, now weighed on him like regret. Never one to be outpaced on a battlefield, Sisera was now simply running, weaving between low brambles and tall grass, his proud banners replaced by dust and sweat. Behind him, the sounds of pursuit echoed, distant but persistent. A wild animal cornered knew this feeling well, though Sisera, for all his cunning, was less graceful when hunted, abandoning the stony paths for the uncertain mercy of back roads. He hurried away, eyes darting for any sign of shelter, any hint of mercy in the unfriendly wilderness. And then, rising ahead in the shimmer of afternoon heat, Sisera spotted Jael's tent. It stood, somehow both plain and promising, like an outpost from another life. Here was not a fortress, nor a barricade, but a single tent at the crossroads, symbol of peace, or perhaps just good timing. To Sisera, nothing could have seemed more welcome, more impossibly safe. With his heart pounding like its own war drum, he stumbled forward. The hush of the tent beckoned him, and the world's noise, the cries, the chariots, even the pressing fear slipped behind. Victory had never felt so far away, and nowhere had refuge ever looked quite so small, so attainable, or so dangerously within reach. Sisera, his once mighty steps now reduced to a ragged limp, finally reached the edge of Jael's camp. The tent stood silent in the glare, unassuming except for the faint scent of milk and barley drifting from within. He paused, chest heaving, and looked over his shoulder one last time. No iron, no banners, just the heavy haze of pursuit fading behind him. He stumbled forward, and with a trembling hand, rapped on the canvas flap. The sound was barely more than a sigh, but in that moment, it might as well have been the knock of despair itself. Jael, ever watchful, heard the quiet plea. She lingered a heartbeat before answering, enough to collect her thoughts, to weigh the weight of a war arriving in slippers at her door. She lifted the flap, letting through a shaft of sunlight and the world's tension. There he stood, Sisera, the storm of Canaan, looking nothing like legend. His face was smeared with dust, eyes darting and wild, hair tangled where the helmet had lost its battle with the afternoon. For all his battlefield boasting, now he looked only tired, defeated, as if the ground under him might swallow up both shame and memory. "Please," he gasped, voice brittle as dry reeds, "give me shelter." Jael did not flinch. Hers was a home built for strangers, a tent where even a man chased by ghosts could rest. She met his eyes not as a subject to her conqueror, nor as a servant to a master, but woman to man, mortal to mortal, on equal and uncertain ground. The flap fell shut, and the world outside faded just a little. Wrapped in the hush, Sisera exhaled, the fear lingering but softened by the simple, impossible mercy of a stranger's doorway. Jael greeted Sisera, not with alarm, but with the practiced calm of someone accustomed to surprises. She offered him a smile, small, measured, with just enough warmth to disguise whatever thoughts moved behind her eyes. Hospitality was the law of her tent, and, in troubled times, the perfect cloak for caution. "Come inside," she said gently, holding the flap. Her voice had the steadiness of water poured from a familiar well. "You look as if you could use restand, perhaps a drink to soothe your journey." Sisera staggered in, grateful and weary, casting glances over his shoulder as though the shadows themselves might have sprouted legs. He sank onto a rug, the tension in his limbs slowly unwinding as the hush of the tent wrapped around him. His breath came heavy, and a line of sweat traced the dust of his cheek. Without a fuss, Jael moved to fetch him something. From a jar, she poured cool milk, an old trick for weary travelers, promising comfort and a touch of motherly care. As she handed him the cup, her fingers brushed his briefly. Steady, sure, without fear or favor. "Drink," she urged with a softness that almost sounded like pity, though not quite. "You're safe here for now." Sisera took the milk, feeling the coolness seep into his hands. With each swallow, some of the panic in his eyes faded, replaced by exhaustion and perhaps an uncertain gratitude. Meanwhile, Jael watched him quietly, her smile never fading, though her thoughts marched in circles as purposeful as any army. If kindness and calculation met that day, they did so beneath the gentle rattle of tent ropes, where every gesture held the weight of unspoken possibilities. As the cool milk soothed Sisera's parched throat, he glanced up at Jael with pleading urgency. Outside, the world still seemed dangerous, full of ghosts and unfinished vengeance. He leaned closer, voice barely above a ragged whisper. "Stand at the doorway of your tent. If anyone comes and asks if a man is here, say no. Swear it." There was the desperation of a hunted man in his request, but also the habit of command. He was a general. After all, even when running for his life, he waited, searching her face for any sign of reluctance or betrayal. Jael kept her composure, meeting his gaze with a poise that could have belonged to royalty, or perhaps to someone simply well practiced in the art of survival. Her lips curled in that same careful smile as before, but now her eyes showed the briefest flicker of understanding. Or was it something harder? A resolve sharpened by years of listening more than speaking. "Rest," she said, as if tucking a nervous child into bed. "No one will harm you here." She reached to adjust his covering, smoothing the blanket over him with a gesture that could only look like protection. If anyone looked into the tent just then, they would see nothing more than a weary guest and a hostess tending kindly to a stranger. Her hands were gentle, her promise soft as wool, and the shadow of suspicion left only the barest imprint on her voice. Outside, the wind picked up, snatching at the corners of the tent. But within, Jael's vow circled in the hush. "You are safe here," she repeated, her words even and measured. And in the gentle twilight of her home, the world's greatest threat settled, at last, into uneasy sleep. Jael stood by as Sisera curled beneath the blanket, his breathing deepening, though never quite reaching the peace of true sleep. She watched him with the same watchfulness she reserved for approaching storms or strangers lingering too long at her well. Here was the man who'd given orders that sent so many running. Now, the conqueror lay defeated by his own exhaustion, stripped of armor and pride alike. She could see the tremor in his hands as he clung to the memory of command. This man, whose name trembled on the lips of children at night, now looked so small, almost pitiful, in the flickering lamplight of her quiet tent. She thought of all she'd heard, the stories of destruction, the women who'd lost more than crops or dignity at the passing of his chariots. and the silent prayers that floated up from Israel's battered hills. Yet, as she observed him, Jael found herself almost wishing he'd been a monster through and through. It would have been simpler if his eyes held only cruelty, if there'd been no trace of fear or weariness. But exhausted humanity clung to him just as stubbornly as the sweat and dust. Still, there was no room for pity, only an awareness, sharp and steady, of what had been placed into her hands. She recalled the old sayings whispered by women under starlight. Sometimes what saves the day comes wearing no armor at all. Jael almost smiled at the thought here. The great Sisera, most dangerous when awake, now most vulnerable, cradled in the arms of sleep and trust. Inside her, an odd mix of sorrow and steel tightened. The world wouldn't remember him as a frightened guest in her tent. They'd remember the shadow he'd cast, and maybe, if hope was kind, they'd remember the quiet courage of the woman who'd weighed both mercy and justice in her small, unremarkable home. So Jael watched over Sisera as he drifted further into slumber, the lines of command softening with each breath, and she wondered how many worlds truly changed in silence rather than shouts. Sisera lay back, eyes heavy, yet still flickering open from time to time. "A little water," he mumbled, the habit of giving orders not yet entirely worn away by defeat. "Please, I'm so thirsty." The words came with a rough edge, but behind them was the weary longing of a man far from his throne and comforts. Jael nodded, as if tending to any traveler, but instead of water, she poured him a cup of warm milk, a simple act, yet one rich with story. Milk was the drink of children and the comfort of sleepless nights, far gentler than water dragged from a distant well. She knelt close, her movements quiet and sure, the cup resting in her steady hands. "Try this instead," she said softly, offering the milk with a small, almost secret smile. "It's something my mother gave me whenever the world felt too heavy to carry wide awake." Sisera took it, lips pressed to the rim, and drank. Some small knot of pride unspooled in him as he eased back onto the rug, the milk warming more than just his throat. Jael drew a worn blanket up over his shoulders, the gesture almost maternal, a curious irony. Considering whose head was now safe beneath this roof, he blinked at her and managed a crooked, tired laugh. "Your kindness shames me. If any tales are told of me, I imagine they'd never mention resting in the care of a stranger." Jael simply shook her head. "In these times, kindness is sometimes the sharpest weapon we have." She smoothed the corner of the blanket, the light in her eyes unreadable. Sisera's breaths grew slower and heavier. For just a moment, amid the ruins of pride and war, peace tiptoed on bare feet through the tentits, silence deeper, wiser, and just a little tinged with irony. As the milk's warmth settled in his stomach, and Jael's quiet presence offered a fragile comfort, Sisera's eyelids grew too heavy to fight. Yet, even on the doorstep of sleep, old habits clung stubbornly. He shifted beneath the blanket, his voice a drowsy echo. "If anyone comes to the door, promise you'll stand there. Tell them no man is here. Promise you'll protect me, just for a little while longer." It was strange, Jael thought, how the terror of a commander could whittle itself down to such simple requests: water, warmth, a bit of shelter, and now a last request for someone to keep watch at his door. All his reputation, his iron, and his authorities, suddenly as fragile as a child's nighttime worry. She sat beside him, not grand or dramatic, just the quiet center of a storm he didn't yet realize had moved on. Her hand rested lightly on his shoulder for a heartbeat. "Rest, Sisera," she murmured, her tone both gentle and just a little weary. "No one will trouble you tonight. Let me carry the worry for now." For once, Sisera did not reply with command or suspicion. He only nodded, trusting her either because he must, or because, in that moment, To argue even with a whisper was a weight too heavy. Before sleep claimed him fully, his hand gripped the blanket, and he pressed one last time, almost like a child afraid of the dark. Just for a little while, keep me safe, with a quiet promise. Jael watched his breathing slow, and the lines of care ease from his face. Outside, the wind rattled the tent ropes like curious fingers, testing the strength of her word. Inside, the mighty Sisera finally surrendered to rest, to exhaustion, and to whatever fate might be waiting in the gentle shadows. The tent, now wrapped in twilight and the deep hush of closing day, seemed set apart from the turmoil outside. Everything slowed in this patch of canvas and colored rugs. Every sound, every breath, the very heartbeat of the world itself. Sisera's massive frame lay heavy on the floor, the rise and fall of his chest growing gentler, the iron edge of his presence dulled by sleep and surrender. Around him, the stillness settled. The goats, nosing the corners for stray grain, grew quiet, as if even their simple curiosity felt intrusive. From the fields came only the gentle chorus of crickets, the soothing hum rising and falling in unhurried waves. Occasionally, a soft creak from the tent ropes reminded Jael that the outside world was close, but, for now, not intruding. The only thing that moved within was the slow drift of a dusty sunbeam, winking out as cloud and evening joined hands on the hills. Even the air felt heavy, thick with the secret kept between the weary guest and the careful hostess. Jael sat close, eyes tracing the lines of Sisera's face. How strange, she thought, to see so much power folded up, momentarily harmless, wrapped in blankets and breathing like any farmhand after a long day. The silence bore down, not frightening but weighty with possibility, like the pause at the end of a tale before a new chapter begins. In this hush, every exhale seemed to carry 1,000 stories, violence and victory, sorrow and triumph until, all at once, the world outside faded away, leaving only the gentle lull of the present moment, the kind of quiet that can only exist on the edge of fate. Jael sat in the stillness, her hands folded in her lap, feeling the weight of everything she'd witnessed and all that yet waited on the other side of night. With each slow breath, her heart nudged between courage and doubt, because strength, she knew, came rarely with a trumpet blast. Sometimes, it crept in quietly, disguised as ordinary resolve. She listened to Sisera's heavy breathing, the sound of a man who had conquered fear everywhere but inside himself. Here he was, famous for his cruelty, dreaming childlike under the tunic of defeat. Jael wondered at the trust he'd placed in her, though perhaps desperation was a quicker judge of character than wisdom ever could be. Could she truly do what the moment called for? With every heartbeat, the question whispered at the corners of her soul. She saw, in her mind's eye, the faces of her people, each one carrying memories of war, of loss, of prayers that never left the lips. In the hush, their hope seemed to hover, quietly waiting to be claimed, to finally break free from the shadow of Sisera's iron. Jael thought, too, of fear, not just her own, but the ancient kind that wrapped tents and villages like a second skin. It would be easier to do nothing, to step aside and let the world stumble ahead as it always had. It would be safer, certainly. Yet safety, she realized with a dry, internal laugh, was already a memory for her, swept away the day Sisera's shadow fell across her doorstep. So she sat, listening to breath and wind and doubt, shaping her fear into something harder. Decision, once only a faint possibility, now grew real in her hands, the way a stake and hammer find their place beside a weaver's shuttle. For a moment longer, Jael allowed herself to tremble. Then she straightened her back and let the hush of the tent carry her from hesitation into a steadiness that felt almost like peace. In the gentle dark, Jael's thoughts wandered to the voices of women she'd known, their laughter snaking through chores, their stories never dulled by hardship. Around many fires, advice had been offered with a sly wink or a knowing nudge, never quite as solemn as a prophet, but somehow just as true. She could almost hear her neighbor, Tamar, teasing as she patched another tunic. The secret to surviving a hard world is to keep your wits sharper than your needles and to hide the good biscuits from your brothers. Another, older voice, her aunt, with laugh lines etched deep, minded her. No problem under the sky is so big it can't be shortened by sunrise and a bit of cleverness. The memory of light gossip, shared plans, and jokes about stubborn husbands or wandering goats danced through her mind like fireflies. How many times had they whispered warnings and encouragements, masking fear with laughter and turning chores into little acts of rebellion. Even in their worries, humor softened the edge. Jael drew strength from those moments, the way women wove resilience through daily life, trading comfort like seeds to plant for darker days. She remembered every sideways glance, every bit of wisdom hidden in a complaint about lumpy mattresses or noisy children. Remember, Jael, someone had once told her, it's not the loudest voice that changes a story, but the one that knows when to laugh, when to listen, and when absolutely necessary to act. As she sat in her tent, wrapped in silence and memory, Jael was buoyed by all those voices, women who'd faced down dread with nothing but a sharp tongue and the will to persist. Their courage mingled with her own, and in that gathering of whispered advice and laughter echoing from the past, she found the strength to meet the hard task that had settled like moonlight across her floor. Outside, the night stretched wide and restless. Wind wandered through the hills, chasing the warmth of day as if searching for something misplaced. Now and then, a low whistle brushed the tent walls, making them sway with gentle persistence. Jael could feel each gust as a present, sometimes a warning, sometimes a comfortry reminding her that the world beyond her canvas shelter was shifting, unsettled. The tent itself became a cocoon, holding its own small world steady while everything else leaned uncertainly toward tomorrow. Inside, the soft light flickered, making familiar shapes waver, jars, baskets, the careful rows of rugs, and the stubborn old hammer lying just where she'd left it. Occasionally, a crabby goat complained at having been herded in too early, protest fading to sleepy grumbles. From a corner, the subtle, metallic glint of the tent stake caught Jael's eye, looking oddly significant in the hush. All around her, the sounds rose and fell, the distant call of a night bird, a pebble rolling loose outside, the muted music of crickets. Each detail seemed sharper, suspended in time's slow stride. The tension of the day and the heaviness of what might come felt undeniable, woven into the hush, so that every heartbeat thudded just a little louder. The air tasted of dust and anticipation, like the pause before a long-awaited rain. Yet with every rustling shadow and every breath of wind, Jael reminded herself that this, too, was her domain. Here, in the balance between chaos and calm, she watched and waited, each sense attuned to the moment when everything would change, and nothing would sound quite the same again. Jael moved through the hush with quiet purpose, her steps barely stirring the woven rugs beneath her feet. The world outside had pressed itself flat against the canvas walls, waiting, as if the night itself were listening for what would come next. She paused at the corner of the tent, eyes falling on the iron stake so ordinary it might have served as nothing more than another anchor in a long day of chores. Her hand hovered for a moment, recalling a dozen mornings spent hammering the stakes into stubborn ground, muscle memory taking over where nerves stuttered. The hammer beside it, worn smooth from years of honest work, now felt heavier in her grasp. It wasn't a warrior's hand that picked it up, but a woman's, gentle, practical, unsentimental. Every shadow seemed to hold its breath as Jael wrapped her fingers around the stake and the tool. They were familiar objects, parts of her daily world, and yet, tonight, they hummed with a different weight, charged with the possibility of ending the fear that came from strangers' boots and men's shouting dreams. With care, she concealed both under the fold of her shawl, nothing about her movements betraying urgency or fear. There was no rush, no wild energy, only the focused stillness of someone who knew both the risk and the necessity resting on her shoulders. She glanced once at Sisera, still wrapped in uneasy sleep, and allowed herself a whisper of bittersweet humor. Trust a woman's tent to become the turning point in a war, she thought wryly. The thought brought a small, steadying smile to her lips. Not victory, not yet, but courage assembling itself in the quiet, stake and hammer in hand, beneath a sky impatient for dawn. Jael's heart beat strong, quick, a rhythm almost louder than the wind outside. Each pulse seemed to echo the weight of everything converging in her small world. She closed her eyes for just a moment, letting the handle of the hammer settle solidly in her palm, grounding her in the present. She remembered her mother's soft-voiced, sharp guiding her through childhood's stumbles and stings. "Steady hands, Jael," she used to say, whether kneading bread or mending fences. "Let your mind lead, not your fear." It was advice handed down in kitchens and gardens, spoken over laughter and the clatter of dishes, meant for ordinary troubles, but fitting, somehow, even now. 100 lessons tangled with the scent of warm milk and the old rug beneath her knees. Patience, vigilance, doing what was needed when no one else could. Her doubts tried to crowd in, but her mother's memory clapped them away with a decisive gesture and a sly smile. A woman's strength is quiet, but it can split stone when the moment is right. And Jael, don't let anyone tell you different. With that, Jael drew a slow breath. No grand speeches, no war drums, just a woman faithful to the wisdom planted in her long before war or fear ever knocked at her tent. She stood a little taller, comforted by the invisible hand of her mother on her shoulder, ready to trust her own courage for the next silent step. The silence in the tent was complete, a stillness that settled on every corner and turned each breath into a quiet event. Outside, the world might have been loud with war and rumor, but here it narrowed to the whispered night song of crickets and the slow, weighty cadence of Sisera's sleep. His breaths were deep, uneven at first, then smoothing out, edges of tension worn away by exhaustion and warm milk. In the faintest silver of moonlight slipping beneath the tent flap, Sisera's face was peaceful, stripped of reputation, fear and folly, just a man alone in uneasy slumber. It was almost difficult, Jael thought, to remember that he was the same. Sisera, whose footsteps once drove entire villages into hiding and whose chariots had ruled the road. Jael knelt quietly, the rugs soft beneath her, the hammer and stake in steady hands. Even the goats outside seemed to sense the need for silence, their occasional bleats swallowed quickly by the hush. The crickets played a gentle rhythmer lullaby for courage as much as for sleep. She waited, heartbeat counting out the moments, watching his chest rise and fall, his body slack in a trust he didn't quite realize he'd given. Each sound seemed magnified, the slide of cloth, a pulse in her own ear, her breath caught on the edge of the next choice. In that hush, heavy with the promise of what must be done, Jael's world hung in a breathless pause. On any other night, it might have been the stillness before morning prayers or the rest between chores. Tonight, it was the soft, fragile cradle of a decision that could not wait for anyone else to make. With the blanket of night still tucked close around them, Jael inched forward, her movements silent, deliberate, unhurried. Every small action was a world unto itself. The way her hand closed around the stake, the gentle lift of the hammer, the care with which she lined up purpose and resolve. Her heart thudded in her ears, impatient and brave, but her hands were steady. She remembered her mother's words again, as if whispered directly into this narrow space. When you must act, let the doing be simple as breath. Sisora's face, so fearsome in daylight, now softened by exhaustion and surrender, held no trace of the force that had shaken nations. In that fragile moment, he seemed no more dangerous than a boy fallen asleep beside the fire, unguarded and dreaming of old victories or, perhaps, at last, of peace. Jael drew a breath, feeling all the weight and history of her people in her chest, and with a swift, practiced motion, brought the stake down. The hammer struck with just enough force, firm, without waste or wildness, proving that everyday hands can sometimes hold the power that changes the course of wars. There was no thunder, no cry, only the quiet finality of a choice fulfilled. History shifted in the hush, and for the briefest instant, every cricket, every sigh of wind, every memory shivered in the stillness that followed. She stayed there for a moment, hand resting on the hammer, honoring what had passed, fear and courage, death and deliverance, all wrapped together in the tense, faint light. And then, as easily as she had begun, Jael let the tools fall to the side, the act complete, a simple gesture in a world that would never be the same. For a heartbeat, time itself seemed to forget to move. The world held its breath inside the tent and beyond, where not even the wind dared to rattle the canvas. All was suspended between the echo of Jael's hammer and the sigh that slipped from Sisera as the dust finally settled. Outside, nothing announced what had happened. No animals cried out, no stars flickered or fell from the sky. The tent was just a patch of shadow and silence, tucked between the folds of earth, a scene unnoticed by everything except the night itself. For Jael, the moment lingered, stretched impossibly long and impossibly quiet. It was as if every memory of fear, every whispered prayer uttered on restless evenings beneath these canvas roofs, had gathered and then, all at once, been released. The tools of her choice lay where they'd fallen, a tent stake, a hammer, both marked by the work of an ordinary life, but now touched by the extraordinary. In that shivering pause, Jael looked at her hands, half expecting them to tremble or grasp for meaning. But there was only a hush, as deep as a well and just as knowing. Then the world, little by little, resumed its gentle turning. The crickets remembered their song. The goats outside shifted, chasing the last dreams of sleep. Time, with a soft sigh, continued forward, and with it, all the stories that would ripple out from this one quiet, decisive act. Jael remained kneeling for a long moment, hands still resting on her lap, eyes fixed on the quiet that had followed. She scarcely felt like the same woman who'd woken at dawn to gather water, sweep dust from the rugs, and tuck loose hair behind her ear. The tent now seemed larger, somehow filled with the layered echoes of what had happened and what would come next. She gazed at Sisera, whose face finally bore peace, however unlikely its arrival. Fear lingered at the edge of her thoughts, mixing with a dawning relief, and she realized, almost with surprise, a flicker of awe. The act itself had required no words, yet the silence afterward seemed to pulse with everything she'd ever left unsaid. Hope, grief, even disbelief that her own hands had carried out what all of Israel had only dreamed for years. It was not just relief that washed over her, but astonishment, too. How strange, she mused, that the story of an empire could turn in a single unremarkable tent, and how quietly the shape of power could be redrawn. She felt both her smallness and her strength, humbled and lifted by the enormity of what the night had demanded on what she had given. For a time, she stayed there, listening to the night as it settled gently back in, aware that she stood at the fulcrum between an old terror and the first hint of freedom. At last, she drew a shaky breath, offered up a silent prayer for the living and the lost, and allowed herself to simply be, not conqueror, not victim, but witness to what courage hidden, patient, and utterly unexpected could accomplish, even in the humblest of hands. In that gentle aftermath, as JL sat in the soft glow of her lamp and the echoes of what she'd done found corners to rest, her mind quietly wandered through memories of darker seasons. She remembered nights spent stitching the tent by firelight, hearing the distant rumble of chariots and the uneasy hush that always followed. She recalled the clenched jaws of women sharing morning water, faces drawn tight with stories they dared not tell aloud. Time and again, hope had seemed as brittle as the dry reeds by the stream, broken by too many defeats, too many days when silence felt safer than speaking truth. Yet somehow, even in the heaviness of loss, there was always a stubborn ember, the refusal to accept that shadows ruled forever. The small kindnesses exchanged, the jokes passed hand to hand, the bursts of laughter that rose up fiercely even when no one felt much like laughing. Little resistances, lovingly sown through hardship. As she sat now, her heartbeat settling, JL understood that courage was rarely thunderous. Most often, it arrived as a whisper, a secret resolve. It crept in at the edges, growing from a lifetime of quiet choices, to endure, to care, to risk hope again despite disappointment. Tonight, that courage had finally reached its sharpest point, not in the roar of a crowd but in one woman choosing, for herself and all her people, not to let fear decide the ending. There would be time for tears, for song, and, no doubt, a dozen retellings, filtered through laughter and awe. In this moment, though, she simply let herself remember. Defeat can linger, but victory, when it comes, is often gentle. Like the touch of dawn on bruised hills, it comes quietly, finding its way at last into the hands of those who dared in one small act to believe. After the hush had settled and the world lifted itself into the arms of early night, JL finally left the circle of her tent. She drew back the flap and stepped out, letting cool air brush her cheeks and the scents of dew and earth greet her as gently as an old friend. The hills around her shadows dipped in silver, sat still, cradling the village and guarding all its secret prayers. For the first time in a long while, the horizon seemed peaceful, its darkness not so much a threat as a healing blanket folding softly over the bruises of battle. The trees whispered in the wind, their branches restful and calm, as if even they sensed some ancient shouting had ended. High above, the stars pressed in, flickering, unbothered by war or ambition, steady as hope itself. JL stood in the quiet, her hands loose at her sides, listening for the world's next breath. She could feel the peace slipping gently into the village anew, uneasy, quiet, but one far better than the trembling calm that came under Sisera's shadow. No more iron wheels creaking, no more footsteps of fear in the grass. Just the simple, extraordinary calm that follows when a long terror is finally broken. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine the coming days, fields safe for laughter, children free to tease the goats without glancing over their shoulders, neighbors meeting in the open, sharing bread and stories as if they had all the time in the world. That vision glimmered at the edge of her heart, fragile but brighter gift that, for tonight, she could claim as her own. With a gentle sigh, JL left the tent's threshold and let herself disappear into the welcoming dark. The hills, standing silent guard as hope, for the first time in years, felt like something you could truly breathe. In the hush of early dawn, just as the stars began to blink out and the softest light hesitated at the edge of the world, JL caught the distant sound of hurried footsteps on the stony path. Someone was coming, moving with the anxious determination of a man searching for what he both hoped and dreaded to find. It was Barak, his silhouette, sharp and alert, swept along the threadbare trail, eyes darting to every tent, every shadow that the night had left behind. Word had traveled swiftly, commander on the run, a woman's shelter. The world shifting in places even the bravest dared not go alone. Each step brought him closer, his sandals scuffing the earth that still remembered fear far too well. He paused outside Jael's tent, the place so ordinary and suddenly so weighty in the dawn. Barak did not barge in or shout commands. Instead, he called out low and careful, voice cracked with exhaustion and edged by wonder. Is he here? The question was more a prayer than a demand, spoken with the strange reverence that comes when you stand at the edge of a story that has outgrown your own. From inside, Jael heard him. She took a steadying breath, preparing to let the world in on what it now owed to the quietest corner in all of Israel. As the first sunlight crept along the ground, the space between old terror and new hope grew small enough for two to stand side by side, just long enough to see what courage had written in the silence of the night. Jael stepped out to meet Barak, the dawn catching a shimmer in her hair and a quiet steadiness on her face. There was no need for fanfare. The world around them already held its breath, sensing the end of one story and the uncertain beginning of another. Barak hesitated at the threshold, eyes darting from Jael to the modest tent, then back, searching her expression for a sign of relief, of danger, or perhaps a hint of what in the world he was supposed to do next. The commander who had led men against iron now found himself humbled at the doorway of an ordinary woman. Jael met his searching look with a calm that seemed almost borrowed from the hills themselves. "Come," she said gently, her voice free from both pride and apology. "The man you seek is inside and his running days are finished." Barak blinked, absorbing the words. He started to speak, maybe to protest, maybe to praise, but words caught at the back of his throat, tangled in awe. In the hush that followed, a simple truth gathered between them. Sometimes it isn't soldiers, nor even kings, who turn the tide, but hands that move quietly, and hearts that refuse to bow. Seeing Barak's surprise, Jael almost smiled. "Not every victory comes with a trumpet," she said, a spark of dry humor in her eyes. "Sometimes it's just tea gone cold and a very sturdy tent peg." The weight in the air loosened a little, and in that brief, shared silence, Barak and Jael stood as witnesses, marveling at the courage that had risen from the earth and settled, against all odds, right there between them. Barak entered the tent slowly, his warrior's stride giving way to something gentler, almost reverent. The space, so ordinary at sunrise, now held the story he'd chased across fields and through sleepless nights. His eyes adjusted to the dim light and then landed on Sisera, stilled forever in the quiet where fear had once lived. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the rustling of Jael's rugs and the distant call of a waking bird. Barak took in the scene, the hammer, the stake, the astonishing finality of it, and realized that the end of Sisera had not arrived in the clash of armies, but in the hush of a woman's courage. He looked back at Jael, his gaze searching for the right words, and coming up empty. There was no shout of triumph, no hurried announcement to the world. Instead, a respectful silence filled the space of silence, heavy with the knowledge that some victories, the truest ones, don't come draped in banners or roaring applause. Barak gave a small, solemn nod, a gesture that said more than celebration ever could. He understood. So did Jael. Between them stretched a deep quiet, woven together by gratitude, disbelief, and a reverence for the strange ways fate sometimes chooses to turn the page. Outside, the world began to wake, but within the tent, time settled for just a moment longer, honoring the unlikely scene and the even unlikelier heroine who had, with quiet hands, redrawn the lines of history. A small, knowing smile touched Jael's lips as she watched Baroque take in the truth of what lay before him. It wasn't the grand victory march anyone might have planned. There were no parades or songs yet. Only the dawn's gold tumbling across the quiet hills and this humble tent, transformed by courage and fate. She didn't boast, nor did she shy from the weight of what she'd done. Jael simply held herself steady, a presence both gentle and unmovable, feeling the final shadow of fear slip at last from her shoulders. The mighty Cicerad, the name everyone whispered with dread, was now no more than a story echoing through these canvas walls. With a simple stake and a steadfast spirit, one era of terror had ended. Baroque looked at her, awe softening the lines of command on his face. For a long moment, neither spoke, as if words might somehow break the fragile peace dawning just outside. Yet, in that silence, something deeper passed between them. Respect, gratitude, and relief, stitched through with the knowledge that sometimes history pivots not on kings, but on those who dare to do the unexpected. Jael let herself relax, just a fraction, sinking into the quiet certainty that her world and all of Israel had changed. Today, the old stories of dread would give way to tales of hope, and around hearthfires for generations, children would ask about the night when one woman's tent became the safest place in all the land. With a secretive quirk of her mouth, Jael thought, well, if nothing else, I suppose I'll have to start charging rent for historic occasions. In that humor, she found her own kind of triumphs, triumphoft, real, and entirely her own. The quiet inside the tent deepened, a gentle tremor of celebration that needed no music or wild dancing. Baroque backed away, still shaking his head as if surprised by the strangeness of a world where war ended not at the point of a sword, but through the steady hand of a woman and her unremarkable tools. Jael stood in the center, straightening blankets and adjusting her hair as though simply tidying after an ordinary guest. The weight in the air shifted, settling slowly into a peaceful relief with only the faintest taste of disbelief. With a sigh, she muttered, I always said this tent could hold just about anything turns out. Even victory is welcome if it wipes its feet. Her gaze flicked to Baroque and caught his smile, equal parts respect and sheepish admiration. Don't suppose you'll be writing a song about this, she teased, one eyebrow raised. Baroque grinned, spreading his hands. I might, but I'll have to leave out the part where the hero borrowed my hammer. The tent filled with a quiet laughter, the kind that soothes and mends after storms. Jael shook her head, mock serious. That's fair. Let's just say, if I ever start an inn, you'll owe a free night for every song you sing on these rugs. The hush blossomed into a kind of secret joyous celebration stitched with shared understanding, humility, and the subtle humor of people who'd survived much and could at last believe in peace. Beyond the tent, the first real light of hope brushed the hills, and inside, the laughter lingered, easy and unafraid. With dawn fully settled and the air washed clean by quiet triumph, Jael set about her morning as she always had. She gathered the pot for water, swept breadcrumbs from the rugs, and called the goats, who promptly ignored her with the same practiced indifference they'd offered every day before history came knocking. There was comfort in the return to ordinary things. She hummed a crooked tune as she tidied the tent, rolling up blankets and checking on her little stores of grain, simple routines woven with the knowledge that everything and nothing had changed. Now and then, her gaze would linger on the stake and the hammer, setting them aside with an odd fondness, as if they were family heirlooms, newly promoted to a place of honor. Neighbors began to drift by, drawn by the rumor that something more than morning bread had risen in Jael's tent. Some lingered, daring a sly question, Others simply offered a nod, respect thick as honey in their eyes. Jael answered with her usual gentle humor, lifted brow, here, a dry remark there. Yes, the old tent still stands. No, I won't be taking up chariot racing next. Life, she knew, had a way of continuing as if nothing extraordinary had happened, even in the very spot where the world secretly changed its course. And so, with the sun climbing higher and laughter once again daring to ring out across the hills, Jael tended her home, grateful to slip quietly from legend back into the rhythm of pots, goats, and peace. The news raced ahead of the sun, weaving through the hills and spilling into every corner of Israel. Word of Sisera's fall spread faster than an overdue rainstorm, each telling brighter, bolder, tinged with the relief that only comes when a long nightmare is suddenly over. People gathered in doorways and under fig trees, faces turning toward one another with open astonishment. Smiles appeared where there had recently only been grim determination. Songs sprang up before noon, drums and pipes waking from their silence. In one village, children made a game of chasing each other with sticks, play-acting Jael and Sisera, the girl always insisting she got the best part. Old men retold the tale with more hand gestures, and each time, the tent stake grew longer and the hammer heavier. Laughter spun through the air, clear and sweet, teased free after years, held tight behind trembling lips. At the wells, women traded their best versions of the story. Some swearing Jael had winked as she did it, others convinced she'd simply served a lethal hospitality with her finest milk. They laughed together, soft and bright, finding strength in a tale where wisdom and courage outwitted strength and fear. As the day faded and fires sparked to life, celebration drifted upward, songs and voices dancing with embers on the breeze. Instead of mourning loss or counting what had been stolen by chariots, Israel rested in the solace of a day when hope didn't just survive, it sang. Every note, every smile was a small act of defiance, a restitching of community, a promise that no night would last forever. In this chorus of rising light, Jael's quiet deed became the lullaby of a new season, each voice adding warmth and wit to the story, a communal memory sewn together by relief, gratitude, and a laughter reclaimed in the name of peace. As the last notes of celebration faded and the soft hush of night returned, the story of Jael settled gently across the land, more than a tale of victory, but a truth folded into every restful breath. In the quiet that follows courage, people found rest not just for their bodies, but deep in their hearts. And maybe, among the singing and shared bread, they learned something vital, that the smallest acts, born in silence and humility, can echo through generations. Jael's story lingers, not because it was loud, but because it was steady. In a world hungry for heroes with shining swords, she brought hope with a tent peg, a blanket, and a well-timed cup of milk, reminding all of us that our greatest strength sometimes looks like ordinary kindness, or the guts to do what must be done, even with shaking hands. So tonight, as you close your eyes and the world quiets around you, hold this in your heart. It is not the iron chariot or the crown that changes everything, but the soft bravery found in the corners between laughter and tears, between one sentence and the next. If this story wrapped you in peace, leave a kind word for others wandering by. Let hope spread the way a smile does, quietly unstoppable. And if you'd like to hear more tales of quiet courage and unexpected joy, subscribe so we can meet here again. For now, may the spirit of small, brave acts told and retold carry you gently into dreams, and may you awake tomorrow with hope that's lighter, laughter that's quicker, and the certainty that even gentle hands can change the world.